What happens when you mock the spirits and leave your shoes outside at night? Will you still walk in the morning, or will something else take your place? In the village of Entonso, nestled between the great baobab trees, there lived a boy named Della. At 15, he was known for his defiant nature, always questioning the traditions and superstitions that the elders swore by. Della didn't fear the spirits or the old tales that kept the villagers in line. To him, they were just stories, nothing more than words passed down to keep children in check. One evening, the villagers gathered around the fire for the night's storytelling. The sky had turned dark, with only the firelight to chase away the shadows. Grandmother Afia, the oldest and wisest of the village, sat in the center, her deep voice carrying the weight of many years. Her words were respected, and every villager, young or old, listened attentively when she spoke. "Children," Grandmother Afia began, her voice calm yet firm. "There are things in this world that you will never see, but you must believe in them all the same. Never leave your shoes outside at night. The spirits that walk in the dark will come for them, and if they wear your shoes, they will take your soul with them." A hush fell over the group as the younger children fidgeted nervously. They knew the warnings well, but the mystery of the spirit still chilled their bones. Even the adults looked uneasy, exchanging glances. But Della, sitting near the edge of the circle, couldn't help but scoff. "Spirits who need shoes," Della muttered, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That's a good one, Grandmother. Maybe they need a pair of sandals for their night walks." His best friend nudged him urgently. "Della, stop, don't mock the elders, you don't know what they've seen." But Della just grinned and shook his head. "Spirits or no spirits, I don't believe in any of this. Shoes are for feet, not ghosts." Grandmother Afia's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the boy's defiance, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the circle, locking eyes with several of the elders, who all nodded in agreement. Chief Kwabena, who sat beside her, spoke next. "Della, the elders have lived long enough to know that there is power in the unseen world. The spirits do not need your belief to exist." Della, unshaken, laughed lightly. "So what? Am I supposed to fear some invisible spirits who need my shoes to walk around? Maybe next you'll tell me not to whistle at night, or I'll summon a storm." The villagers murmured quietly, some agreeing with the boy's boldness, but others frowned in concern. Yor leaned closer to Della. "Please, Della, listen to the elders. They've lived through things you can't even imagine. Just don't tempt fate." Della shrugged him off. "I'm not afraid of any of these old stories. Tonight, I'll prove it. I'll leave my sandals outside and nothing will happen." Yor's face grew pale, his hands gripping his sandals tightly. "Della, don't. You're making a mistake. Don't test the spirits." But Della stood, his chest puffed out with arrogance. "Let the spirits come then. Let them take my shoes. I dare them." Grandmother Afia's voice rang out softly but firmly. "Some lessons," she said, her tone heavy with warning, "are learned only when it is too late." Without another word, Della walked off into the night, his defiant laugh echoing in the distance as he left his sandals outside the door of his hut, oblivious to the weight of the warning he had just ignored. That night, after Della had left his sandals outside, the village of Antonso was quiet. The fire had long since died down, and the villagers had retreated into their homes. But Della lay awake, his thoughts swirling like the wind outside. He had laughed at Grandmother Afia's warnings, mocking the spirits who supposedly roamed the night. As he lay in his bed, trying to sleep, he heard it. A faint whisper, soft but clear, like a breeze brushing against his window. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding. It was just the wind, he thought. His mind raced, but he dismissed the feeling and pulled his blanket tighter. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep again, but the whispers grew louder, They seemed to call his name, faint but persistent. Della. He froze, his skin prickling with cold. The air around him felt heavy, like the night itself was pressing in. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, the wind playing tricks. He shut his eyes tightly and tried to ignore the sound, but soon the whispers stopped. The silence was even worse than the noise had been. The wind outside howled, now blowing hard against his hut, making the walls creak. The chill in the air seemed to seep into his bones. He couldn't sleep, not with that feeling of being watched. When dawn finally came, Della woke with a start. He rubbed his eyes, still groggy from the restless night. But as he reached for his sandals, a chill ran down his spine. They were gone. His sandals, which he had carelessly left outside the night before, were no longer where he had placed them. He stood up in a panic, rushing to the door and looking around, but they were nowhere to be seen. His mind raced. Could it be true? Could the spirits have taken them? Della shook his head in disbelief. He had mocked the old stories, never imagining that something so strange would happen to him. Yor came running to his hut, his face pale with worry. "Della," he called, his voice filled with fear. "Your sandals. They're gone, aren't they?" Della's throat tightened. "I don't know. I thought I left them right here." Yor grabbed Della's shoulders, shaking him. "You've invited the spirits, Della. You didn't listen. Grandmother Afia warned you, but you laughed." Della pushed him away, but his bravado was gone. A cold fear settled deep in his stomach. "But I didn't believe. It's just a pair of sandals. It can't mean anything." Yor shook his head in disbelief. "This is no joke, Della. You have to go to Grandmother Afia. She's the only one who can help now." The two boys ran to Grandmother Afia's hut, finding her sitting outside, her weathered hands resting on her cane. She looked up at them, her eyes sharp despite her old age. "Ah, my foolish boy," she said softly, her voice a mixture of sadness and resignation. "You have done what no one should. The spirits have taken what you carelessly left behind. Your soul is now at risk." Della's face went pale. "What do you mean, Grandmother? I just left my sandals outside. How can that take my soul?" "Grandmother," Afia sighed deeply. "It is not the sandals, Della. It is the disrespect for the spirits that you have shown. They are not to be mocked. If you do not retrieve what they have claimed, your soul will be lost forever. The spirits are not kind, and they do not forgive." Della's mind spun, his chest tightening with dread. "How can I fix it? How can I get my sandals back?" Grandmother Afia's voice grew firm, her eyes narrowing. "The spirits are not easy to bargain with. You must find the sandals before sunset. If you do not, they will return for more than just your shoes, my boy." Della nodded silently, his heart heavy with fear. He turned to leave, but just as he stepped outside, a tall figure appeared at the edge of the village. The figure was cloaked, in shadow, tall and imposing. He moved with an unsettling grace, his footsteps silent against the earth. Della's breath caught in his throat. The man was wearing his sandals, the very ones he had left outside the night before. But the stranger's feet left no marks on the ground. The village was still, too still, as the man walked slowly toward Della. He spoke, his voice deep and unfamiliar. "Who left these for me?" The words were cold, like the wind that had blown through Della's hut that night. Della stood frozen, his heart racing in his chest. The village was silent, the air thick with fear. The spirits had come, and they were not what he had imagined. The villagers stood frozen in fear, their eyes wide with terror as the shadowy figure approached Della. The whispers of the elders grew louder, their voices hushed but filled with dread. Della, however, stood firm. His heart hammered in his chest, but he did not back down. He stepped forward, his voice shaking but filled with resolve. "Give me back my sandals," he demanded, his eyes burning with defiance. "I was wrong to leave them outside, but I am not afraid of you." The stranger only chuckled, the sound cold and cruel. "You gave them to me freely," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Now they are mine." The village elders murmured among themselves, casting fearful glances at one another. "This is no ordinary man," one of them whispered. "He is not a man at all." As if to prove the elders' words, the stranger lifted his hood, revealing a face that made the air still. Della gasped, his knees weakening. The face staring back at him was his own. The villagers gasped in unison, their hands flying to their mouths in shock. "It is his shadow. His spirit doubled," Grandmother Afia whispered, her voice trembling with understanding. "The spirit has taken his form, and now it will walk his path." The stranger grinned, an eerie smile spreading across his face. "Since you gave me your path, I shall walk it for you," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. Suddenly, Della felt a coldness wash over him. His limbs grew heavy, and a weakness he had never known took hold of his body. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to shrink. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he realized with horror that he was fading, his body growing colder, lighter, as though he were no longer solid. The villagers cried out in terror, but Della could not hear them. His vision darkened further, and he looked up at the stranger, his own face grinning back at him, and saw that the figure was growing stronger. The spirit's form seemed to swell, its presence overpowering. Grandmother Afia shouted, "He is turning into a shadow! The spirit is claiming him!" Della felt his body weakening with every passing second. His hands, his feet, his chest, all felt numb, as though he was slipping away into nothingness. The stranger, his double, stood tall and powerful, while Della seemed to grow smaller, weaker. At that moment, the village chief, Quabina, stepped forward, his face grim and resolute. "You must break the bond before nightfall, or he will take your place forever," he commanded, his voice filled with urgency. The villagers looked at one another, fearful but trusting in their chief's wisdom. Grandmother Afia moved quickly, reaching into her pouch and pulling out a handful of white chalk. She threw it toward the stranger, chanting softly under her breath. The chalk hit the stranger's chest, and for a moment he staggered back, his form flickering like a flame in the wind. The villagers held their breath, watching in silence. With a deep growl, the stranger stepped back, but his grin never faded. "It will take more than that to send me away," he said, his voice echoing with the weight of the spirits. "We must perform the ritual of redemption," Grandmother Afia said firmly. "Lead him to the shrine before the sun sets. There is still time." With the villagers' help, Della was guided to the sacred shrine. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Della's legs felt weak, but he kept walking, his heart pounding. He had never felt so small, so vulnerable. At the shrine, Grandmother Afia knelt and placed a new pair of sandals on the stone altar, offering them to the spirits. "Place these sandals at the shrine and beg for forgiveness, Della," she instructed. "You must cleanse yourself of your disrespect." Della did as he was told, placing the sandals on the shrine with trembling hands. But that was not enough. Grandmother Afia handed him a bowl of sacred water. "Now, you must wash your feet, for the spirits will only forgive you if you humble yourself," she said. Della knelt, his body heavy with guilt and fear. He dipped his feet into the water, the coldness biting into his skin. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I am sorry, I was foolish and I did not understand. Please, spirits, take back your claim. Let me live." As he rose, a distant voice echoed in his ears. "Next time," the stranger's voice whispered, "I will not leave empty-handed." Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the stranger vanished, his form dissolving into the night like mist. Della collapsed to his knees, exhausted and trembling. His body returned to normal, but he could still feel the coldness of the fading, the emptiness that had come close to swallowing him whole. Grandmother Afia helped him to his feet, her voice soft with wisdom. "The spirits are powerful, Della, but you have learned the hardest lesson of all. Respect the ancient ways, for they are not to be mocked." Della sat in silence by the fire, his mind weighed down by the events of the past days. He had once laughed at the old stories, dismissing the warnings of the elders as nothing but superstition. Now, after facing the terrifying spirit that had nearly taken his life, he was a changed man. No longer did he mock the traditions of his people. Now he understood their importance. He had seen the power of the spirits, and it was not something to take lightly. Yor, his childhood friend, sat beside him, staring into the flames. After a long pause, Yor spoke, his voice soft but serious. "You were lucky, Della, very lucky." His eyes met Della's. "Some who leave their shoes outside are never seen again. The spirits take them, and those souls are lost forever." Della looked down, his hands trembling slightly as he thought about what might have happened. "I never believed it could happen. To me," he confessed. "I thought it was all just stories. But now I see I was wrong. I will never make that mistake again." Yor nodded, his face solemn. "None of us do, until it's too late." Grandmother Afia, who had been watching the conversation from the edge of the firelight, stood and slowly walked over to where the boys sat. The villagers, who had gathered around the fire, fell silent in anticipation. Grandmother Afia was respected by all, and her words carried the weight of generations. She spoke softly, but her voice was clear and strong. "The spirits walk among us unseen," she began, her words slow and deliberate. "They are not to be mocked. They are not to be disrespected. If you leave your shoes outside for them, they may decide to walk your path." The villagers listened closely, and Della's heart sank. Grandmother Afia's words were a reminder of the price of disrespect. Della had given the spirits his path by leaving his sandals outside, and they had claimed what was theirs. He had been fortunate to escape, but the spirits were not always so merciful. Grandmother Afia continued, "Della was spared, but not everyone is so lucky. Some who challenge the spirits, who mock their power, are never seen again. They are taken and their spirits wander forever." She turned to face the rest of the village, her gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "Remember this lesson well, children of our ancestors. Do not stray from the ways of our people. For if you do, you may find yourself lost, as Della almost was." Later that night, Della carefully placed his new sandals beside his bed. He locked the door behind him. As he lay in bed, Della thought about the price of his ignorance, and he promised himself that he would never again challenge what he did not understand. He would respect the spirits, and he would respect the wisdom of his elders.